I have to tell you, I don't know how many people have asked me to interview you, and I've been chasing you for a couple months. So I'm really grateful to have you on today.
Yeah, sorry to be so hard to pin down, but retirement is actually a lot busier than I thought it was going to be.
I love that almost all of the biometricians that I've known that have actually retired don't actually retire. So it's probably time to catch up on the things that you wanted to do, but you couldn't get done while you were working.
Exactly. And you can play too, so there's time to rest your mind. But um, well, David Marshall and I retired very close to each other within 3 months, and he's taking the I'm staying away from doing business kind of thing, but he's still doing analysis. He's still working on stuff. So, and for me, it's a way to stay alive. Keep my brain active. I want to keep trying stuff out, having fun.
Right. And you sent me your bio, and I had been going through it and seeing, like, man, are you active? Like, I knew quite a bit about you, but I didn't know nearly what you've done and the things that you've learned over your career. And I have to tell you, man, you're a machine. Like, how do you have the energy to do all of that and then still keep going into retirement? It's great.
That's I was going to say a good observation. I don't know if it's good or bad, but at my retirement party, I told my boss I'm going to give a talk. So because there were some things I wanted to say, but mainly it was to tell my team a little bit about how I got to where I got, and it was kind of just a series of coincidences, like life is. But one of the things that I mentioned during that talk that I am sincere about is that I had the good fortune of always being in the presence of people that were way smarter than me. And so it was a wonderful environment. I couldn't lose because there was always something to learn from somebody and always someone to keep me stretching myself to keep up. So I might have been busy that whole time, but really it was running my tail off trying to stay up with the pack.
Yeah, I guess that's important. I mean, there's something about being the smartest person in the room and something about not being the smartest person in the room. But if you surround yourself with people that make you work hard and make you move, then you're definitely going to push yourself to limits that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. I had the good fortune to attend a talk that Lou Rosenbach gave, and he gave the talk. It was kind of talking about his life, but he finished the talking. They decided to go to lunch, so we were walking across campus to go to lunch, and I got to do that walk with him, just talking about stuff. And so this is 80s, in the 80s, and we were talking, and Lou was actually telling me about parallel computing, and just blowing my mind with stuff that I'd only just dreamed about. Could maybe someday we could do this, and he's saying, "Here's how you do it. Here's how you do this." So that he set a pretty high standard for keeping yourself intellectually active and interested in stuff.
Right. There's been quite a bit of changes over your career in terms of computing power.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that we have the ability to do. So I'm thinking back to Mike Strube talking about how at Weyerhaeuser you couldn't store, or you didn't store inventory for all of your lands. You had the mother function, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about not everyone is fully aware of the systems at Weyerhaeuser that you have now, but I imagine they're quite more advanced than that.
Yeah, well, probably we've been talking about running to catch up. Running to catch up to technology is something that has been really difficult, but also really fun. I mean, it's just been crazy. When I started work out of school, my first job was to build a growth model for two growth models for Northern California and Western Oregon and Washington for international paper. And we had to write the code in Fortran. No, pardon me, it wasn't Fortran. This is really bad. This may cause you to wonder seriously about our sanity. It had to be in COBOL.
Oh,
We wrote the program in COBOL, and eventually it migrated to a hybrid of COBOL and Fortran, and it ran on a System 34, IBM System 34 mini computer, which gave us 64K of RAM to do everything in. So we learned really fast that a lot of our ambitions about how to build a growth model were going to be tempered by how much computing power and memory that we had available to us. So tree lists weren't an option. They were too long, too big. So everything went to diameter classes, and everything got collapsed down and fit into this tiny little memory space.
yeah, it's interesting seeing how even currently how forestry data are still stored. And I'm very happy if I get a stand table, but you get these one-liners with just the big five roll-up essentially of the products by pine or hardwood. And so then you're looking at that going like, come on guys, like we have much better memory systems now. We can store so much data. I bought a 12 terabyte hard drive for like $200. Like it's like, come on guys, let's get with the times. We can store more data.
It's curious to me, curious and frustrating, and I'm sure you've seen this. In sales packages, land and timber sales packages, you get these stand listers, which are just what you said, one line per stand, tells you really nothing other than maybe where it is. Sometimes you get that. And that behind the scenes, they had to have collected the data to have a very rich understanding and description of the trees and the stands they have, but they're not giving it to you. It's just, why?
Yeah, and you have to wonder in those sales packages if that's done on purpose. I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything malicious, but you wonder like, okay, why are the data so weak? Because obviously you've been making management decisions, and I know how to make management decisions, and I don't use that level of data to do it. So
my last job at IP, I like to tell people my last job was to sell off the West Coast, and I wasn't in a position to make the sale, but I basically created the sales package and helped buyers with all the due diligence and so forth. Because my role at the time was A&D work for them, and the amount of detail that went into that was pretty significant. But it was after parties had committed in substantial ways to making the deal happen. So all of a sudden the doors open and people get inside and see what's going on. So, but yeah.
How did you get started in forestry? How did you get interested? What was the kicker to push you to go to Oregon State?
What's my origin story? So I went to a Catholic high school, and it was pretty much modeled to be a college prep high school. And I knew nothing about forestry. I had spent very little time outside in the woods or anything. And being a teenager, a friend of mine in school came up to me and he says, "Hey, you want to get out of school for a week?" And I said, "No, it's too good to be true. How do you do that?" He says, "No, I know. I've heard about this program. You can get out of school for a week and you go to a camp." And I went, "Well, tell me more about it." And it turned out what he was describing was a outdoor education program that the county that I lived in was initiating, was a couple years into it by that time. And it took high schoolers as counselors for sixth graders, and it was environmental education. I'd never done anything like that. I thought, I'm not going to make it because I don't know anything. And this, no, they'll teach you. But he kept emphasizing, you're going to be out of school for a week. This is the key. This is the important point. So I went and I fell in love with it. I thought it was great, and learned a lot, probably more than the sixth graders did, about the life sciences, the outdoor life sciences, so soils, water, plants, and animals are the 4 resource areas that they had. And I just wanted to do more of it, and I ended up doing a lot of it over time. So that kind of doubles down, because you got to keep up with your academics. And I was going to a school that academics was number 1, so that was really important to do. But you get this time doing something that was completely new to me. So that inspired me to meet with my academic counselor at the high school and said, I'd like to design a forestry class. I didn't really know what forestry was, but I thought this is the way to do it. So she was a science teacher, and she said, yeah, I'll help you design the curriculum, and then you can take the course and get credit for it. So I've got a forestry credit on my high school transcript, and it's a course that I designed and took, and I thankfully passed. And that just got me on the road, and through a series of happenstance and coincidence, I met people that kept inspiring me along that line of wanting to be outside, wanting to understand how things worked in the outdoors. And one of those people said, you should consider going to a forestry school. And Oregon State was available, and relatively close, 90 miles away from where I lived. And I went there. I got into forestry school. It took me about 1.5 years before I figured out what in the heck I got into. But went from there, and it's kind of the things that keep happening along the way that you don't plan, but just change your career trajectory significantly. Just kept on continuing. I got my bachelor's in 79, and at the time, most people coming out of forestry school went to work for the Forest Service in the West. They were a big employer, lots of opportunities, and that period of time was the beginning of one of the deepest depressions in the forest industry that in my lifetime. And so things were going backwards in terms of job availability. And I think we had about 100 to 120 folks in my graduating forestry class, forest management class. And just a handful of those people got jobs in the industry. The rest couldn't find jobs. So another happenstance, my faculty advisor at the time had been using me to help his grad students do field work. And he said, you should just do a master's. And I said, okay, I should just do a master's. That sounds good. And once again, it was one of these things that opened the door. Since I was helping grad students, I got a feel for what research was like, and really picked an interest in me in that line of finding out new things, doing groundbreaking work, and reading scientific papers and all that stuff. And anyway, so that just got me into grad school, and boom, I'm going. And so another happenstance, another thing that changes your career trajectory. I was on the road. I figured get my master's, look for a place to do a PhD, and just follow the line. So that's kind of, I was marching in that direction. And I defended my thesis, and as I was walking out of the room so the committee could deliberate, and at those times they deliberated and told you within minutes. It was amazing how quickly that happened. But anyway, I was walking out, and David Hand was on my committee, and he walked out the door with me, and he said he kind of pulled me over a little bit, and he says, "Whatever you do, don't go back to school right away. Get a job, get some real life experience, and then figure out whether you want to do that or not." And I actually thought he was crazy. But no, that's not the way it goes. But that was in the back of my head. And within a day or two, a friend of mine who I'd gone to undergraduate school with called me up and said, "Hey, there's a job at IP at a research center not far from where you live, and are you interested in building growth models?" I said, "Never built a growth model before, but sure, why not?" And boom, I was hired, and off I went, and never looked back. So
Interesting how just circumstantial that all happened, just from you, like not even knowing anything about forestry and not being interested at all, to just having a week, out of school.
Yeah.
Then rising to lead probably one of the largest and most technical biometrics teams in the world. So you did all of that. You didn't have to go get a PhD. So it was obviously great advice that in terms of your life, your career, you could have been completely different if you had went, and probably would have had to go somewhere else for a PhD and not stay at Oregon State.
Yep, definitely.
Do you think that today somebody might be able to follow a similar path, circumstantial as it may be, get a master's, don't go out for a PhD, and be able to rise up through the ranks like you've done?
That's a good question. One part of me wants to say yes, it's possible, because I've seen very talented folks that have got enough research tools and analytical tools, say in a master's program, to go forward, and they've been successful and continue to be successful. But then part of me says, there's just something about taking that final step, and the PhD, it's really your time to do your work, your own work, and show the world that you can do it. And I think that's an entry card into a lot of things that you don't get if you don't go that way. So I think the paths are still possible. They're just very different, and one may be harder than the other depending on where you want to end up.
I'm curious too, because now it's just, I guess, so predominant that if you're going to do a master's, you generally go to do a PhD. When I was doing my master's, similar to you, I finished my undergrad in 2008. Jobs were difficult at that moment. Yep. I went to do a master's, still 2010. In analytics, jobs were still quite difficult. There were not that many around. And to the point that when there were jobs available, the competition was so high. I was interviewing against people with 15 to 20 years of experience. So, and then for me, it was natural just to jump into a PhD at that point. But I definitely wanted to work after my master's. I wanted to get that real world experience. I see a lot of people that also want that, but they get hesitant because the natural path is just to go straight to a PhD.
And you get out of the habit, so to speak, the cadence of doing it, being a student. There's something to it, and staying in that zone is useful. I mean, it's kind of a survival skill. But I don't know. I was fortunate enough, along all those series of happenstances, that Weyerhaeuser decided to buy the company I was working for, or take it over, depending on who you talk to at the time. And I got absorbed essentially into I'm going to say this, but it's not going to sound right. What had been a preeminent forestry research organization, forest science research organization. And the reason why I hesitate to say that is because it sounds like I'm dissing what is there now at Weyerhaeuser, and I'm not doing that. It's just different. Back in the 70s and the 80s, everyone on the outside, because I was on the outside, used to call it University Weyerhaeuser. You know, there were more PhDs on staff at Weyerhaeuser than there were in many faculties around the country. You know, it's just an incredible place, and the company had gone all in on R&D, on trying to find stuff out, and we're successful at it. The data that was amassed, the experiments that were put in, I would put that up against anybody. So that's the place to go, you know, if you're, and I just by happenstance, by the luck of the draw, actually what happened was, you know, the CEO of Willamette went over and became the CEO of Weyerhaeuser, and he decided to buy his old company. So, but the result of that was I got pulled into a team with Mike Strube and Dave Heinck and several other very notable scientists and biometricians, and then a whole array of other scientists in other disciplines. It was just amazing. So the knowledge finding and the environment of just being inquisitive and being able to get the resources to do stuff about it was really amazing.
Yeah, I can't imagine any other entity that probably has the R&D budget that you were working with, like that, and their Weyerhaeuser's focus on actually doing the research and improving their systems is just it's beyond amazing how they've done that as a company, and it's probably why they are as successful as they have been.
Yeah, you hope so.
Yeah.
All organizations are subject to their own foibles, and Weyerhaeuser's just like any other organizations. It's got positives and negatives, and it's really. To me, it's interesting. One of the things, kind of a mantra that I tried to get the people that were working with me to think about was this idea that we as biometricians, for instance, growth and yield people, we're not very good at talking about in a way that a financial person could understand, talking about how we generate value.
Yeah.
We do. And I think it's just it is it's pretty much impossible to imagine working in the tree growing business that we are all involved in these days without the level of analytics and the research foundation that is supporting it. I just couldn't imagine doing that.
Right.
So there's value there.
Right.
So, but how do you talk about it? How do you quantify it? And it's really difficult. I spent some time looking around for academic work on it, and there is a little bit, but not a lot. And it's not very satisfying to a CPA accountant type who might be in a high level in the company. They want to see they want to see a bottom line impact. Mm-hmm. And like I say, I strongly believe it's there. It's just we need to be way better at talking about it.
I've been thinking about this recently, actually. In my role, I work with forest landowners who are, from 1,000 acres to 100,000 acres. So a much smaller land base than what you're dealing with. But being able to actively communicate the value added in something as simple as just a forest inventory.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I never thought I would have to convince somebody that knowing what's there is highly important, because that tells you the value of what is there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I drew the analogy to like Walmart. Like, you wouldn't expect a big chain store to not have an inventory of their stock, right?
Right.
This is your inventory, this is your stock, this is your value. And so that's why it's important. But I don't know how well that goes either, because they're going, yeah, it's just trees, you know?
Yeah, but it's such an interesting business. Your tree growing business, the timberland side of it. Your machinery are the trees, but your product asset is the trees. So you need to know what's out there just to be able to state your asset. What's the valuation of your company just on some of the parts, kind of an approach. You need to know what's out there. You got to be able to say. And in biometrics, that's at least mensuration in biometrics. That's why it exists, is to quantify that and do it in a reasonably precise way. So,
and not just the quantification, but the projection of value, the projection of assets, and that depends on the quality of the inventory, so of the quantification. So,
yep.
And that's one thing that I've been working on, is how to show, the different levels of variability that exist for different types of inventory and how they affect future projections. So whenever you're going from a kind of smaller confidence interval to a much larger confidence interval, depending on where your data come from.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's curious that when we take our inventories and project them forward with growth models, what happens is the variation decreases, because it's essentially a sophisticated regression to the mean.
Right.
And certainly the model is doing that. So it's removing apparent variation, but the variation is still out there.
Right.
So you're getting this answer that looks more and more precise on its face, which isn't. It's actually getting worse.
Right.
And telling that to a finance person just blows their mind.
I love when they take an annual inventory and just divide by 12.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, that doesn't really work that way.
We were developing a growth model for some species in Uruguay, and just triggered a thought. And the thing to wrap your mind around is the trees are growing year round, and they're growing fast year round. So it was on the table to at least think about growing things on a monthly time step, which is just blows my mind, at least. But
I seem to get a lot of review opportunities from papers coming out of Brazil, and loblolly pine. Seeing the age there is months instead of years, going like, whoa, and seeing them like double or triple the basal area that we have here in the Southeast. It's just insane.
It's crazy. It's really crazy.
And what an experience also to get to work with South American data. My wife is from South America, from Colombia, so I spend a lot of time down there, and I'm always looking for opportunity to get into something interesting. But it seems like those couple of places, like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, like all of those are like where the most productive forests are anyway in the south or in the southern hemisphere. So that was a part of Weyerhaeuser that you were working down there? Yeah. Did you travel down there, or were you just working with the data?
No, I worked with the data. One of the unfortunate things for me, another one of those things that just happened is I didn't do a lot of international travel, but I did work on models in both hemispheres, and most of the major continents. But travel Canada was about as far across the border as I got.
Which was just a hop, skip, and a jump for you.
Exactly. Exactly. We did have folks on our team that went to China, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay. Weyerhaeuser was in a partnership in Uruguay, and actually a partnership in Australia as well. So there were people that did travel. It just wasn't me.
I get, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have to travel to do our job. We can sit behind a computer from anywhere in the world, which I say fortunately because it makes it really nice if you do want to travel. And then you can continue working. I think the pandemic really changed a lot. Although I hear at Weyerhaeuser it was a callback to the office. So the corporate entities there decided that remote work was not where they wanted to go, which is fine.
Yeah, you'll have to ask someone who's more informed. I know rumors, but I don't know anything for sure. I do understand that from a managerial standpoint, I there's some comfort in seeing everyone. Yeah, but really, when the pandemic hit, my team at least, I think on any objective metrics was more productive. There was a social cost, and a mental well-being cost, but from a productivity standpoint, we got a lot more done.
Yeah, it's a toss up between having those couple of hours that you would have spent commuting that you're now just sitting in front of your computer, and then those conversations that naturally occur around the water cooler where it sparks an idea or something that wouldn't otherwise happen over a video call.
Well, the folks who worked with me probably, they never said this to me, but they were probably annoyed as all get out, because I had no problem just pulling up a chat box in Teams or whatever, and just dropping in on somebody and at a moment's notice. And mainly because that level of interaction, the water cooler stuff, I think is really important. And for me, if I got an idea, I want to talk to somebody about it. So, and I don't want to type it out necessarily, but we get on a video conference and we can get it done.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way now that I think about it. Whenever I have a thought, like I want to get it out and I want to have the conversation, because if I don't do it right now, I'm probably going to be on to 5 other things by the time I get to have the conversation. So might as well just do it and get it over with. And if it sparks something good, great. If not, we move on.
Yeah.
Also, good to keep your team on their toes. Let them know, hey, you probably should be doing what you say you're doing.
Yeah, that the work environment is so changed, and like we were speaking of earlier, the technology has enabled so many things that make that all possible, and make so the productivity can be maintained, and you can make some semblance of staying together, even though you don't have that direct personal contact. And now with the pandemic out of the way, at least, we're not quarantined and all that. Going to meetings and seeing people there is really great. It's good to get the real conversations,
Right, exactly. It's definitely been nice to get back to in-person meetings. We missed that for the couple of years. Having these very large virtual meetings with 100 people on little tiny squares was just not productive at all. I feel for the grad students that had to give their presentations this way, and so you don't have to have that experience of going in front of a crowd and actually presenting your material.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
But the few that we've had so far have been great. They've been so productive, and I feel almost like a re-energization after the pandemic, that now people are excited to do it again. And I feel like we're making, like, again, really good progress in what we're doing in terms of the research and development. And
Yeah.
so maybe there's the place for both things to happen.
Yep. Yep. Maybe, you know, in the end, maybe we'll get better, like you say, get better at everything. And just because it forced us to reset a little bit and think about things differently. Yeah.
For sure. So I wanted to ask you, because you've worked for several different companies, a lot of time at Weyerhaeuser, but you have been a part of starting and finishing several growth and yield models that have been used over those companies. So I'm curious, how many times have you started from scratch to write a growth and yield model and completed it?
Well, started from scratch. That's almost never.
Yeah.
Almost never, in the sense that there was someone did some foundational work to make it all possible. The first growth model that I worked on was at IP, and that was from scratch. We didn't have a code base. We didn't have an internal model to work with. And just before I got there, a whole new inventory was designed, and field work was being commenced, collecting data for a system that didn't exist yet. So basically, this data was coming at us, and we had to have a way to store it, manage it, and to grow it. So that was from first principles, and we were really young, really naive, and we got it done, and we were pretty proud of ourselves. But you know, in retrospect, since I've built models on similar species, I now know that model was horrible.
Yeah, right.
It fit the data well, but where I am today in the way I think about modeling and is a culmination of the experience through all those modeling processes, looking at a lot of data in a lot of different growing environments, and seeing what breaks, what doesn't work. And so that was from scratch. When I went to Willamette, they were using a model that Jim Arney built for the West, FPS. I used that for a year and realized that it was not performing very well for Douglas fir, but also for Western hemlock, and Willamette had a lot of Western hemlock. So it was a significant problem. And they had a lot of mature Western hemlock, which is even a bigger problem because there was a lot of value tied up there. So I went about capitalizing on the work that I knew David Hand was doing with the Southwest Oregon version of Organon. So he had a framework, and he had experience collecting data from temporary plots and coring things back. And I decided that I could mount a quick data collection effort using those protocols and recalibrate or build a hemlock model. And I thought, where am I going to put it? So I basically reverse engineered Organon, because Organon at the time was not public. You couldn't get hold of the code. So I reverse engineered it, took all the publications, and basically built Organon from scratch. And then put the hemlock stuff in, hemlock data that I collected and analyzed, put that in, and it worked a lot better. So it was really, the model performance, I think, that we were concerned about was really probably a function of not a lot of data for a Western hemlock. And then, because I'd had experience with Organon, when Weyerhaeuser absorbed Willamette, they were stuff I can't talk about, but they had come to the conclusion that the models that Dave Heinck and Mike Strube and others had built which were basically distribution, Weibull distribution type models. So I actually can't remember now if it was parameter recovery or parameter projection, but one of the two. It was whatever Dave Heinck had done in his PhD work. I should know that. That's a failing on my part. Anyway, there were some problems with that model, and the model fit the data well, but the performance of the model in use for inventory and planning purposes was falling down. And so they had been in the process of deciding whether or not to mount a new modeling effort. So I come in, I've got experience with Organon. I showed them that Organon did some things that they found to be very important. As an example, many models in that era, so this is early 2000s, were using maximum density as a way of making sure that your mortality systems were behaving properly. So it basically enforced it onto a 3 halves self-thinning trajectory. And I was able to show Dave and Mike that Organon, at least the way it was parameterized, that property was emergent. It didn't have to be enforced. It just arose from the equations. That was really attractive. And the second thing was that it was a treeless model, and individual tree resolution or tree level resolution would solve some of the problems that operations was having with the distributional model. So it basically was a nice confluence, and Weyerhaeuser had a lot of data, and that enabled us to fit a really good model. And it's, as far as I know, it's still in use today. So
yeah, so that's amazing that you've developed a model that has been more than 20 years now in use. Yeah. Like, so that speaks to the quality of the model.
Yeah. Quality of the model and the quality of the data. I can't emphasize it enough. I've recently, in retirement, I've been working with Aaron Weiskettel, and initially, I had some free time, so I decided, well, I'm going to take this R code and program it into C++, because I was trying to keep myself up with the new C++ 23 standard. So I wanted to try some things out with that and just have some fun, at least what I think is fun.
Yeah, right.
But as I was doing that, I was finding things that were either problems, bugs in the code, in the R code, or there was model formulations that I didn't think were biologically reasonable or could result in a biologic behavior. So I was just firing Aaron email after email after email. I think I became a real nuisance to him. He says, well, here, and he sent me all the data. You don't like it, fit it.
Right.
So I'm just about done. I've refit all the growth equations and mortality equations for the model, and it's got a C++ version working. And so to accomplish that objective, but in the process of doing that, the approach was taking these equations that had been used in the official version of the Acadian variant of FES. Those equations all fit the data really well. And if you look at the residual analysis, because I redid the residual analysis, they all look great. But the behavior, the dynamic behavior of those models didn't work well. And some of it I kind of knew was going to happen just because of the equation formulation. I said, no, that's not going to work. But some of it was a little bit of a surprise. And so I was able to refit those, get the fits that were close to, but sometimes not as good as the published equations. But the model behavior, the dynamical behavior of the system works much, much better. So no caps, no arbitrary constraints, nothing like that in the system. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think probably what, definitely grad students probably don't see is that it's not just, you're not just chasing some kind of metric to compare how well the model fit the data.
Yeah.
It's how the model works, all the equations together, how it extrapolates is highly important, because while Weyerhaeuser might have the most robust data set in the world, most people don't.
Right.
And are literally extrapolating every day of the week. So how well do the models extrapolate?
Yep.
And so your R squared improvement of 0.02 doesn't if the model doesn't work well.
Exactly. It's I'm sure it's frustrating, especially for someone coming through school. They're learning all these really cool techniques, and I know I was this way. I was looking for something to hang my hat on. Well, if I got this number, if I got an R squared this much, then it's got to be good, right?
Right.
No, not necessarily. And then you learn over time that it's so easy to for the data to falsely manipulate those statistics. And so you get things that look good but really aren't very good at all. And,
right.
But I can't emphasize this enough. The Dave Hand was a really important mentor for me in many ways, but one of the things, most impactful thing in growth modeling, is that Dave spent a lot of time, years, building the first version of Organon. And there was quite a bit of frustration, I think, among the folks that were waiting for that model to come out because of that long gestation time. But when you talk to Dave, every equation, every component of every equation, he can tell you what the biological underpinnings of that term is. Oh, this is there because it's picking up this, and it should be bounded by this and this. Meaning, when you fit the equation, if the parameter estimates don't come within that range, you know something's wrong.
Right.
And it was just incredible to me the deep insights that he had into it, and the purposeful construction of the equation. It wasn't all combinations regression, which I did back in the it was like, no, that can't be there, because that there's no biological basis for it. It's just, it may be correlated with the variation that you're seeing, but you have no idea what it's going to do when you put it into the wild.
Yeah, probably the biggest, I'll say, mistake that I see is people using classically the Chapman-Richards equation. So they'll fit an asymptotic model to data that are not asymptotic, or they don't have the asymptote.
Right.
And you're going, okay, let's think about this.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic approach to modeling this set of data? Just because it fit well and you found that model is highly used in the literature, did it work? I do like biologically based, like a differential equation that makes sense. I've said this on the podcast before, but comparing that to now, many people are jumping to machine learning methods to come up with new models, which of course fit the data way better than some of our differential equations. But it's the black box. You don't know why they've chosen the path that they've chosen, and the minute that you need to extrapolate, it falls apart.
I feel that people talking to me should think of me as an old fuddy-duddy. When it comes to machine learning and AI. I'm very skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
And I've given several talks on it that displayed my intense skepticism. But it really, in the end, it boils down to just exactly what you said. It's a black box. It does fit, in air quotes, fits the data well.
Yeah.
But you don't know what it's doing, and it's not telling you anything really insightful about the system that you're modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that you and I should have a conversation, and we should be able to look at what a model's output is and say, oh, I know why it did that.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Oh my God, how did it do that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I see I see the space for machine learning methods. I'm thinking about in, some of these, for example, inventory capture by photogrammetry or by LiDAR or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to work very well in those spaces. Image classification, change detection, all of those kind of things, it seems to work. But whenever you want to project an inventory, I just, I'm not sold. I like you, I'm skeptical.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in the LiDAR realm, obviously, because of its association with other similar image analysis problems that have been at least appear to be successfully modeled using AI machine learning type systems, there's a strong attraction there, and partly because you don't have the benefit of that we do with trees and tree growth is that the biological system, understanding the biological system helps you in that modeling effort. With interpreting a point cloud, there's not a lot we can fall back on in first principles and rest on it. So it's really already a black box in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure that where I was at Weyerhaeuser when I left, I was a strong proponent of a parametric system to analyzing point clouds.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, you look at the literature, there's a lot of efforts going on that are not doing that.
Yeah.
And I don't know who's going to win. I think that had I continued to be there, I would have maybe have been a roadblock, to progressing.
Yeah.
But the parametric systems, again, I knew how they worked. I could tell you why it did what it did, and when something went wrong, which it inevitably does, there was a way to look in under the hood and have a reasonable chance of figuring out what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just me.
I'm curious. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, I'll say, our empirical models, but our classically based differential equation models versus a process-based model like 3PG.
Well, you and I haven't had that talk. So, how to put this politely? I don't like them. So I need to qualify that statement. My perspective is coming from someone who's worked in the biometrics area, the growth and yield area for a forest products company.
Mm-hmm.
So the objectives there are to understand the growth of those trees to produce products. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty specific thing. Right. It's not to understand the ecophysiology of a forest system for some other purpose, for instance. Mm-hmm. So I will at least open the door. I will at least leave it open that there's a possibility that process models or hybrid models could be a way of answering some questions about those forest systems that an empirical model wouldn't. Mm-hmm. But I have never seen a case where a process model did a better job at projecting forest inventory for the purposes that a forest products company would use it for.
Right.
Never seen that.
Right.
In fact, they're horrible.
Yeah.
And, so just following along this line, because I'm working with Aaron Weiskettel, Aaron for in his graduate work, he worked on a hybrid model. So it's a process model linked to an empirical model. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of attraction to that, and it's getting a lot of play right now. The hybrid approach is getting a lot of play because the thinking, it's a seductive, and I would say there's big warning flags about this. There's a seductive line of thinking that goes, well, if we successfully hybridize this, we get the benefits of the empirical model, but we have a way to bleed into that system things that we don't know how to model, which means these days climate change.
Right.
So what happens if temperatures warm? What happens if CO2 levels double or something like that? You know, what would happen? Mm-hmm. What happens if water precipitation, water availability changes? Those are all really important questions, and the empirical models don't have a chance of getting at it right now because who's got the data?
Right.
You'd need a C-trees on steroids to to get at these questions. So there's some real attraction to it. But looking at Aaron's model, after he got done with his graduate work, I hired Aaron. He worked for us for about a year before he went to the university. And one of the objectives in hiring him was to bring that hybrid model idea mechanics into Weyerhaeuser to see if we could use it. And it just wasn't successful. Part of it was that at its heart, most of the ones that I'm familiar with, which is likely to be a subset of all the process models out there, they all, one way or another, are making a prediction of productivity based on leaf area. Mm. And leaf area has an issue in many forest systems. For instance, the West, it's a problem because there's a saturation point. You get to a leaf area of 7 or 8, which you'd never get there in loblolly pine, but leaf areas at 7 and 8 are not uncommon. Mm. In very heavily closed canopy systems like Douglas fir, western hemlock, and so forth. So we know empirically that volume accumulation, basal area accumulation occurs after that saturation point, but leaf area does not. So the correlation between the commercially important aspects of tree growth and leaf area break down at those levels.
Yeah.
So there's a difficulty there, and the process models would have productivity just going bonkers because of this link with leaf area.
Right.
So there just wasn't any way to reconcile that. Mm-hmm. The second thing is if you looked at the resolution of many of the biogeoclimatic data that go into it, so rainfall, water availability, etc., it's really, really coarse. Mm. So way coarser than we know the say within stand variation, you wouldn't have a chance of picking it up because you don't have data at that level of resolution. Mm-hmm. So it would suffer an application to basically making broad kind of generic adjustments or predictions of growth when in forest industry, at least, we're constantly trying to get better at getting local, mm-hmm. being hyper local if you could. Anyway, so Sorry about the diatribe, but
It's interesting because we still rely heavily on site index as our estimate of productivity.
yep,
How we actually measure or estimate site index on any given stand can vary greatly.
yep,
And, you know, in many cases, it's basically just an assumption that not necessarily measured. And then how we adjust that for treatments, you know, is definitely, there's not as much data on adjusting site index for treatments. And
right,
if site index is even the most appropriate place to adjust for treatments, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so, but connecting that back to the process-based models is like, okay, is the hybrid approach kind of a way to try to move away from site index, which I still don't see. I personally don't see the best way to move away from site index. It's just, it seems to work. So we're going to keep using it until we get something better. But I don't know if the hybrid model is the answer. And then
yeah,
that connection to machine learning, is there some way to come up with the better decision support system
hmm,
based on the limited information that we have? Of course, again, at Weyerhaeuser, you had a wealth of information there to use, but the rest of us don't have that. So
yeah.
I don't see us getting away from site very soon.
I have given several talks since I've been retired on site index should die.
Yeah.
Site index, which is probably a 2 or 3 podcasts worth of me blathering on about it. But
Yeah.
I hate it. And my master's was building a site index equation, so I'm guilty as charged. You know?
Yeah.
I think we need to be honest with ourselves about our ability to describe the variation in productivity, productive potential. Let me put it that way: productive potential across the landscape. I don't think it's very good, but even if no, I shouldn't say it. I don't think it's very good, and so I think we have a crude understanding of how productivity potential varies across our ownerships. When you put non-site index based estimates of productivity into your empirical models to try to build them up, they don't perform very well.
Right.
And usually it's rejected and folks fall back to site index. So I think what we've done is we've fooled ourselves. We really don't understand productivity potential very well, and it's not performing well in the model because we don't really understand it very well.
Right.
It's just not. It's probably, if you had a perfect estimate, it's probably well correlated with productivity with our empirical estimates, but we don't have a perfect estimate, and the crudeness of our estimate makes that relationship less productive from a modeling standpoint. Then you get the fallback to site index. Site index typically works because many of the models are constructed in a way that it's incestuous. It's basically giving the answer to the model before it starts.
Right.
And because site index is usually estimated from the data that you're using to build the growth model and so forth. And so it's got to be better. It's
Right.
got to be. And I have begun to throw out this idea that if you take a component of growth, like diameter growth or whatever, and you look at how site index enters that, you could think about that as in this following thought experiment. You could model, you could estimate the parameters of that growth equation without site index in it on a plot by plot basis. And then you would see that there was likely to be some terms in that, some parameters in those equations that vary substantially from plot to plot. So what you really have is a location effect.
Right.
And what site index is doing is it's trying to serve as a location effect.
Mhm.
But we're using site index as that surrogate, but site index isn't a terribly good surrogate for the location effects. So it kind of going back to this idea that we really don't know as much as we think we do about it.
Right.
And so if you told someone, if you had all those plot-based equations out there and you told someone to independently, not based on those trees, but independently estimate the productivity there and plug it in, it wouldn't do as well as the site system that you put together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the problem. Unfortunately, I have no great idea on how to fix that.
Yeah.
I just don't.
Same here. It's interesting how well correlated volume growth is to just something as simple as change in dominant height.
Yeah.
Which is probably why site index works so well, because it's based on that change in height and age. Well, I guess on the average makes it work, but like you said, it's not a real site index. Can change depend on your treatments, and it also can change depend on changing climate and all sorts of different variables. And so while it works, it's not a good estimate of productivity, as you said. But how do we keep crutching along, or at what point do we make the jump to something different? And so far, like you, I've been thinking about this for not as long as you have, but 8 years or so, and I'm going, what else can we do? Because, well, one, the resolution of the data that we have to pump into our models is probably not good enough to explain productivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's obviously a hard problem, and there aren't any easy answers to it. But I think this is really important in forest industry. It's important because if you are associated with acquisitions, divestitures stuff, you know that site index can play a huge role in your valuation work.
Yeah.
Yet we don't understand it very well. We don't estimate it. We almost never measure it properly. Yet it's making this huge impact. If we were honest with ourselves, this is revealing my bias here. If we were honest with ourselves about our ability to quantify productivity, we would say that we don't know it at the level of precision that we're able to state it with a site index number. And so when we do our valuation work, we should not be making valuation decisions on small changes in site index. But those small changes in site index, if you just run them through the models, can make huge changes in the economics.
Right.
Shouldn't do that. I think you're fooling yourself.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've heard jokingly, and I wonder how jokingly it is, that if you don't like your answer, just bump site 2 feet.
Well, that happens.
Yeah.
I won't name names, but over the long course of my career, I've seen a lot of that happen.
And it's interesting too to see, especially in the literature now, that people are incorporating, and probably have been for 20 years, but incorporating climate variables into the model, and they don't seem to add as much information as you might think they would.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with Doug Mainwaring. He's the staff analyst with the SIPS co-op at Oregon State. And they have a model where they introduced climate, water availability kind of variables into the model. And the model that they ended up going with, at least the last time I saw it, has both site index and those variables in it. And I made a comment to him that I didn't think that was a reasonable thing to do. And because of my penchant for hating site index, you should probably just take it out of there.
Right.
He said, oh, no, but when I add site index in, this is Doug saying this, when I add site index in, even in the presence of these climatic water variables, the fit improves. Well, sure.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But that's not the point.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And then I think, the closer your climate and soil variables and all that get at getting at the underlying productivity, the more you've got. You should have, if site index is a good is any indication, you should begin to have more and more collinearity, if you will, or at least a degree of association between those things. And then it's basically you got redundant variables in your model.
It's a good point. I don't know that this is a problem that's going to be solved anytime soon. I know we're going to keep throwing money at it anyway, and hopefully some brilliant person comes along to help us out. I'm curious because you have your hands in so many different things to do with inventory and growth and yield and projections, and I'm curious over your time period, in your career, what has surprised you the most in terms of changes to our systems or improvements from technology or just in general? What was the biggest thing that surprised you?
Yeah, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
That's lots of little surprises along the way. I guess a couple of surprises. One is because of the strong culture in the South around non-treeless models, so whole stand models, distribution approaches. I didn't think I'd see a day where treeless type model architectures were going to gain traction, and that's clearly changing, and to me that's a surprise.
Yeah.
A lot of good scientists, biometricians in the South, really made it hard to displace that system. So there was good reason to stick with what you had because it was, it was working. But that's changing, and I actually think that's good from the standpoint as a community of practice. The more folks are working on attacking tree level growth variation and understanding that, I think the better we're all going to be. We're going to learn some stuff, so that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So that was a surprise. Kind of overcoming a lot of momentum, inertia. I mean, not a momentum. The massive change in computing capability has just made things possible today that we were dreaming about, but thinking we'd never see. And so the inventories that we have today are massive. A lot of companies, TMOs, are going to LiDAR-based inventories so that they're getting huge tree lists, and it's not a problem. It can be done, and that to me is really exciting and kind of a surprise because you think about it, really didn't take very long for that to go from no, not possible to wow, easy. And I think we're like I said at the NEMO's SOMENS meeting, I think we're going to get to a point where we will not need stands from the standpoint of thinking about how to understand the forest. We will know, or at least have an estimate of where every tree is, and or tree-like thing is.
Right.
And we'll be able to summarize it any way we want, and just give ourselves way more flexibility.
Yeah.
So those changes, just hard to imagining that. Just even 10 years ago it was hard.
Yeah, I remember 10 years, well, it's probably more like 15 years ago, Mike Strube giving a presentation and talking about blobs. So we weren't even talking about trees at that point. He was talking about blobs from the LiDAR point clouds, and seeing where we are today, and going back to your presentation that you gave at the Nemo Summits meeting, we're potentially making errors in terms of identifying all of the trees. Yeah. We're overcounting in places, undercounting in others. But my largest concern is then how are we getting at our diameter distributions from that? Because you went back to what you said earlier, we're trying to estimate products. Products is where the value is, knowing where those products are. And so now if we're using some kind of height diameter equation or some machine learning method to get diameters derived from heights. At what point are we again putting ourselves in a bad spot where we're doing something because that's where the technology has gone, but it's not necessarily where we should go. So it's maybe a bad branch in the path.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that too. There's a couple of things there. So in forest inventory, because of the expense and difficulty in measuring heights, we didn't measure a lot of them. So we had a modeled estimate. It was based on some ground truth data from the inventory, but it was imperfect. It's a hybrid estimate, but mostly it's made up. It's imputed. So now with LiDAR-based inventories, it's the reverse. With the thing we're estimating more often now, in fact, almost always, is diameter. So it's not new in the sense that we've been dealing for years with imputed data. Now it's just a variable that we used to know for sure. It's been flipped on its head, so to speak. The other thing that I worry about there is that many managed forests, the variation in height is less than the variation in diameter. So that means that we're trying to predict a more variable thing from a less variable thing, which, as you're aware, is not the way to go. You got regression to the mean, and now you got regression because your explanatory variable isn't very variable. And there don't seem to be. I think I can say this without giving up anything proprietary. There doesn't seem to be much traction. You can't improve upon that problem with auxiliary information from LiDAR. It does help, but it doesn't fix it. And that was always the hope, that some other LiDAR metrics could be auxiliary variables that would induce more variation in your predictions and do a better job, but it doesn't seem to be the case, at least so far. Maybe we'll get there,
But I wonder if we might move away from, so we're already moving away from traditional forest inventory, actually physically going and putting plots or points in. But if we might move to something more akin to basically, like you said, adding auxiliary information. So instead of going and measuring plots, we measure diameters along the way. And instead of measuring, 10 trees in a circle, we measure 10 trees along the row or something.
We tried to think about how to design a complementary field sampling scheme, because you're going to go put in ground truth plots anyway to calibrate your LiDAR machinery.
You should.
Well, yeah, you would be well advised to do that, but it doesn't always happen. That's going to be a limited set of data, just time, expense, etc. You're just not going to get a lot there, and it doesn't necessarily provide a representative sample of diameters within the context of your LiDAR system. There's a lot to that, but just for the sake of being, it doesn't. So it's difficult to think about how to do that. But let's say you could do that. If you had that data, how would you use it to adjust your LiDAR estimates? And that's not as straightforward as it sounds.
Right.
So, I think there's a way to get there. I actually think that that's probably the right way to think about it. You know, you look at an ownership, various things have happened. Maybe thinnings have occurred, maybe fertilization has occurred, things that affect the height diameter relationship. Thinning is a good example because it can over time dramatically change that. LiDAR isn't a dynamic system. LiDAR is taking a picture, and that picture of the, so to speak, the relationship between height and diameter is going to be different for a thin stand versus an unthin stand, or from a poorly stocked stand due to some environmental characteristics to one that isn't. So you might, it kind of leads you to begin to think about, well, do I need separate LiDAR estimation equations for each of those conditions? And since you're in the business of remote sensing, are you going to be able to remotely sense, from remote sense data, detect what condition you're in so you can apply the right equation to it?
Right.
So there's a lot of fun there. There's a lot of things to work on.
Yeah. Well, tying a couple things together, I mean, you mentioned LiDAR, and then going back, you mentioned tree list. Mike Strube is now a big proponent of tree list because, of course, why wouldn't you be when you can get data at that resolution? But he's in the Nemo Somans meeting, he gave his talk on basically individual tree site index. So now he's taking site index and applying it, because with LiDAR, you can get repeated height measurements on trees. And now you can basically reverse engineer the model to get a site index estimate at the tree level. And so we just talked about not being able to calculate productivity very well. Now what happens whenever you're applying it to a billion trees?
Right. Well, I think there's at least two problems, one of which the repeated LiDAR measurements can help solve really well. If you were asked to develop a system that would do a good job of updating your inventory every year, so you're going to need a growth system to grow your inventory forward. And why it would be advantageous to know what the contemporaneous growth rates are, observed growth rates are on your stands. You can do that with LiDAR, at least for height.
Right. So
now you got a set of data that you didn't have before, and it's telling you in real time how your trees are growing. I think that could be extremely useful at tightening up the annual projection of your inventory, just the inventory maintenance, and maybe substantially reduce the need for revisits, either ground sampling or new LiDAR flights or whatever. It could help quite a bit. But if you put your other hat on, what do you use inventory for? It's to do harvest scheduling. It's to do acquisitions, divestiture work where you're doing long-term projections. It's not going to help you. I don't think it helps you there.
Right.
It may get you started, but for a piece of bare ground, what are you going to do? You don't have any information. So.
Exactly. Yeah. I anticipate that whenever I'm retiring and starting my own consulting business, the systems are going to be very hybridized. We're going to be pulling everything we can, and there are going to be places for everything. We'll have some places where we're doing machine learning and our differential equations, and other places. You just mentioned the bare ground one. We got to get them up to something. So when you don't have information, how do you do that? You have to come up with a good estimate of it. And, that being said, a part of this podcast being called the Forester's Forecast is your forecast of the future. Where do you think we're going? That was, of course, my forecast, but what do you think we're going to?
In terms of being able to project?
Yeah, projection systems, inventory systems combined. I mean, thinking about from going back to having a mother function and not storing inventory to where we are today.
Yeah.
Where might we be in 15, 20 years from now?
I said this recently, and I think this, if I play it out, I think it's possible that we will get ourselves, our community of practice, sufficiently comfortable with tree list level inventory from LiDAR. And the reason why it's important to say that is that the component that I think is going to enable all this to happen is being spatially explicit. So it's not that you know that there's a tree or there's a tree-like thing, but you know where it is. So if we get a community of practice, if we get ourselves and our technology to a place where we're comfortable with that, and we have a better understanding of the error structure in that system as well, which is another thing to work on. I think that we should begin to think about growth models that don't grow stands of trees or plots of trees. It should grow trees. And so it removes the stand as a description of the growth context for the individual tree. There's some challenges there. There's quite a bit of literature that basically did runoffs between different competition indices. Is distance dependent indices better or worse than distance independent indices? And actually it's equivocal. In fact, you can find papers that say the distance independent ones work just fine, or sometimes better than the distance dependent ones. So that means that just because it would be spatially explicit doesn't mean it's better.
Right.
But it's different. So now think about site index. Site index is an attribute that we attribute to a stand or to an area, not to a tree particularly. Right. So we'd have to rethink how that works. We'd have to rethink some of the commonly used competition, one-sided and two-sided competition metrics that we have, like basal area in larger trees, those kinds of things. Those are plot dependent in some respect metrics. Now those go away. So how do you define it? How do you do it? But I think those can be overcome. I think there's a way to get there. So then think about growing your inventory. You just push the button and say grow the inventory, and it just starts going down your tree list growing trees. And it doesn't stop until it's done. Right. And the advantage of that is that it's from a computing complexity standpoint, it's got lower complexity, and it's massively parallelizable. Yeah, right. Every tree is independent, so you just grow it. I think with cloud computing technology, just the way it is right now, with a massively parallelizable, inherently parallelizable system, we could have ultra fast updates of our inventory. We could play scenarios out that we don't do now because we just don't have the time and computing resources to do it. I think we'll get to a point where we can do that.
That will be a very impressive place to be for sure.
If we ever get there.
And I can't help but think about like the advances in like quantum computing and how that's going to trickle down into our field eventually. I mean, we're probably not relatively not very far away from that. And how is that going to change our, we're adding more and more information now in terms of, now you're talking about billions of trees, growing billions of trees.
Yeah.
that going to work whenever we have quantum computing and it's doing it like that?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and at what point are we all going to be out of jobs because the computer's doing it for us?
Not anytime soon. When I really hang my shingle up or take my shingle down, so to speak, I doubt we'll be there. So.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The conversation has been so amazing, and I appreciate your insights. And it's been great to learn more about you and your history. And you've been very inspirational to a lot of people, and I know you're going to continue to be. So on behalf of the biometrics community, thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate doing this, and I'm honored that you thought that I would be worth talking to. So thank you.